So it looks like we have a little over 100 participants on the call right now. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our kickoff of our speaker series for our curriculum renewal process at the Zucker School of Medicine. Today we are very excited to get started with this inaugural talk. Before we move into the introductions, if it's okay, we have a poll, and we'd appreciate for those of you in the audience if you could just complete the poll so we have a little bit of an idea of who we have joining us today and what each person's background is in terms of medical students, alumni, faculty member, staff member, just to help give us some context to who the audience is again, because we can't see everybody, but we can see a portion of you, but this will let us know. So it looks like we have a lot of faculty, primarily faculty on the call, about 85% faculty. Then about 11% of our attendees are members of our staff. Then we've got a little bit of alumni, MS4 students, and MS2 students. So very excited to have everybody here today. And we're really, really glad that you're able to join and help us really launch and begin to think about how we want to think about our curriculum renewal. So welcome again. I'm Dr. Samara Ginsberg. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Education here at the Zucker School of Medicine. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our Dean, Dr. David Battinelli, to give us a few introductory remarks about our esteemed speaker today. Then we'll move into sharing a little bit about his bio and get started with the talk. So Dr. Battinelli.
Yeah, great. So Samara, thank you. I'm going to let you do the bio part about Dr. Hirsh, but for those who aren't aware, Dave Hirsh has been a friend to Zucker from the earliest of our thinking about a medical school, and this has influenced us in many ways. We've invited him back here as sort of the kickoff for what will be a speaker series. And it's, you know, the point of the speaker series is to keep us inspired and motivated and thinking about the science of learning, as is the title of his talk, because that's what we're trying to promote. And it's my personal opinion that there are some things that happen in education that actually don't promote learning, but somehow inhibit learning. And we're extremely interested in trying to get a better handle on how we can do what is our job here, which is to educate our students as best possible so that they are as best prepared for whatever careers they want to move into. Since, as I tell all the applicants, the good news is you'll probably get into medical school. The bad news is when you finish medical school, you're not even halfway done. So this is all about making sure that people understand this is about learning to love to be a doctor, and learning to love learning, since as physicians, that's going to be your life's work. So without further ado, Samara, tell us about Dr. Hirsh and his bio, which goes on forever, but we welcome him. I'm here with Dr. Smith, and it's great to be reunited with Dave Hirsh.
Excellent. All right, so I'll share with everybody that Dr. David Hirsh graduated summa cum laude in history from Dartmouth College. He earned his MD from the University of Virginia and completed residency at the University of Michigan. Go Blue for the Wolverine fans on the call. Dr. Hirsh directs the Harvard Medical School Academy Medical Education Fellowship and is the co-founder and director of Harvard's Cambridge Integrated Clerkship, which is the first academic longitudinal integrated clerkship, or LIC. We know how we love our acronyms here too at the Zucker School of Medicine. He was the inaugural George E. Thibault Academy Associate Professor as director of the Harvard Medical School Academy of Educators. Since 2021, Dr. Hirsh serves as Harvard Medical School's Associate Dean of Undergraduate Medical Education in Cambridge. Dr. Hirsh was the longest serving medical director of Cambridge Healthcare for the Homeless, and he co-founded a community health center. He practices primary care within Cambridge Hospital's OBGYN Center, mentors student and faculty research, and teaches students in all years of the Harvard Medical School curriculum. His greatest joy is his family, his wife and 3 children. And as Dr. Battinelli alluded, we are all here to talk about learning how to help students be the best doctors they can be and really love to do what they do as physicians. And I think there's probably nobody better who truly embodies that than Dr. Hirsh. So we welcome you and take it away.
Well, first, thank you. That was very kind. And let me just say that it feels actually like one of those talks when you come home. I've had a good chance to go to a number of medical schools in the U.S. and this is the one I feel like I come home to, and it means a lot to me that Dean Smith is here and to see my longtime friend Dean Bettinelli as well, and Dean Ginsburg and the bunch. So just thank you for that, and I will try to be on best behavior, but only a little, I promise.
We're counting on that.
The only other thing I want to add, I think, at the outset is that I think giving talks when you don't know anybody is substantially easier than giving talks when you really highly regard the people. So there's also that added twist. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opportunity to share the screen for a moment. Here's the clumsy part of every talk when you switch over to the share screen. You see my funky background there, and then we'll put on the talk. There you go. But before I do this, let me just make an absolute sure. Okay, good. Can everybody see the Sciences of Learning state of the art with the crimson background?
Mhm.
All right, perfect.
I'm
All right.
sorry, just one quick thing I forgot to mention, thank you, Elizabeth, is that we're going to use the Q&A function. So if people have questions during the talk, if you'll please put the questions into the Q&A, and then I'll be monitoring the Q&A and be able to share those questions either as appropriate during the talk or at the conclusion of the prepared remarks. Thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you. All right, so you see the title of the talk. Now I want to at the very outset make clear here, there is learning science, learning about science, learning of science, and there's the sciences of learning, sometimes called the learning sciences, which are the empirically derived sciences that help us understand about learning. So that is our topic for today. All right, so I have no conflicts of interest or financial disclosures, except to say that I'm kind of zesty about the subject here, so you've been forewarned. All right, so we're going to start with educational sciences that we should remember over the course of the day's short talk here. Test-enhanced learning, desirable difficulties, spacing of learning, interleaving of learning, and the self theories of Professor Carol Dweck. So these are the 5 topics which we're going to go over today. And what we'll do is we're going to actually embody, we're going to animate, we're going to use these very topics in the talk. So it's sort of a play within a play. So these are things I'm going to hope that by the end of this you've learned and that we've gone around many, many times in many, many ways, such that you can hold on to these hereafter and hopefully employ them in your own teaching, in your own learning, but certainly in the curriculum redesign. All right. There are 3 requirements for remembering. One is encoding, one is storage, one is retrieval. What are these? So encoding is the idea of acquiring knowledge. We often think of this through the lens of I'm studying, I'm trying to push it in. Storage, I hold on to it. I have this knowledge that I pushed in, I can use it later. Retrieval is using it later. So these are the 3 parts of learning themselves. Now, from where do these come? It turns out that one would have thought there's some science lab or social psychology or cognitive psychology lab. No, these actually come from a classified work at the University of Michigan, known as the Michigan Project, which is part of the US Army. They were actually trying to solve riddles of spycraft, particularly around radar. I actually found the now unclassified document. It was a spin-off finding that those 3 elements of what it takes to remember, those weren't actually the intention of the warfare work. But I found the documents anyway. You see here it's unclassified. We're not going to get in trouble. And here's actually the thing that explains the work. But importantly, what I'm actually doing now is I'm partly stalling, I'm partly delaying, I'm partly telling a story. And a lot of this I want you to think about as ways in which one can learn. So stories themselves help with learning. Having pauses away from the content itself can help with learning. And after all, here we have with this Michigan paperwork, if you add a little intrigue to it, with spycraft, intrigue can help people tap in. So I realize this wasn't the best story ever, of course not. But I want to sort of animate the idea that through these sort of side stories that give a little intrigue, it's helpful for remembering. All right, so back to our point. There it is. All right, but the main point of the talk are these 5. And I took you aside to those remembering things only so I could come back to these 5 after a pause. So that's a pause within a pause. So hold on to these ideas because now I have to ask you questions. Pre-test. Do you think it's interesting? Even the word test here has just changed your capacity to remember the 5 things. The 5 things. So when someone knows they're going to be quizzed about something, it actually heightens their ability to hold on to the memories. It's interesting. If you have too much tension, actually, too much stress about learning, you actually don't learn as much. And if you have not enough kind of fire to learn it, also it's harder to remember. So saying that there's going to be a pretest should offer just enough stress that you can hold on to these. So here's our pretest. If you can just think and imagine in your mind's eye, what were those 5 domains of learning? Of course, when you looked a moment ago, you didn't know you were being pre-tested. I hope you realize, even from this silly little exercise here, that by not knowing that, you weren't paying as close attention as if I had said to you before the 5, I'm going to ask you in a moment these 5 things, right? But if you had pen and paper, I'd say to you, can you write them down? There's also learning science about this. Writing down seems to have more memory effect than typing, which has more memory effect than simply sitting and listening. Or if no pen and paper, you can just say them to yourself aloud. This invites a story, because stories are part of this learning science issue. If I say to you this, I have had the chance as an adult to learn some Spanish. The patients I see in Cambridge often speak Spanish. I've also had a chance to learn Portuguese. I'm not very good at either one of these, but I celebrate and value these 2 languages. The problem is the Spanish and Portuguese in my head is much better than the Spanish and Portuguese out my mouth. So it is important when you think about these things, what you actually know is what you can reproduce, not what you think you can reproduce. So this recitation issue here, you'll see, say them out loud, actually is helpful for ensuring you know them. It's also helpful for building memory pathways. So there's a lot actually in this quiz. We're not going to do the quiz now, but I may just do the quiz at the end, right? So hang on to this later. I'm going to ask you those 5 domains throughout the talk. But the point I really want you to hold on to here is it is not the same thing to know something or believe you're going to remember it. It's actually doing certain activities to generate remembering. So that's actually the essence of the talk today, is how we can do those things that generate better remembering. These are the 5 things. I will, in fact, be asking you again. I will be, in fact, using these throughout the talk. I will be making these strange asides throughout. And the goal is that you can hold on to each of the 5 things and all the 5 things at the end. So at this point already, if I were to stop, I show you the list of 5 things. Are you looking now with the intent to be quizzed later? Are you looking at them as like a unit of 5 things, or do you see each thing singularly? Is this the same order as the first time I put them up? So I want you to also recognize that the fact that you've even seen them before does not guarantee you're seeing them better now. That's another thing that we teachers forget. Like, we can just show the students multiple times and they'll definitely get it if I just keep repeating it. Not true. There has to be a different kind of approach than merely just repetition. So for example, if I say to you something like, are these in the same order? That adds a little bit of intrigue and question for you. If I say I'm going to quiz you again, like I said, that will help. There's at least one more. Recognize that when you see it the second time or the third, you're actually even less attentive than when you saw it the first time. So if you want to be sincere in your ability to see things repeatedly and have that be of use, you've got to attend at least as well or more upon repetition as you did at the outset. So I'm going to stop with these multiple asides, but say to you, please try to hold on to these things. These are important, and they'll help a lot with your future learning and your future teaching and your school's wonderful redesign. Okay, before we do this any further, a little word about pictures. There's a great literature on the value of pictures rather than words. So far I've done 2 things which are not as good as pictures. One is I've talked at you a lot. I've given you all this language and mumbo jumbo. The other is I've shown you like slides full of words. Better than that would be this, right? And I'm showing a picture about pictures. And for those of you who are not my age, this is known as a camera. And in the olden days, we used to, all right, we use phones now. But please hold on to the idea also that we're trying to have people hold on to memories. It's better to have an image actually than words. Words and images together is fine. Words, images, and lots of rambling, fine too. But you have to make sure you also consider this the power of images. All right, back to the 5. Are you looking as seriously at the 5 right now as you were a moment ago? Because I think you're not. I can't even see you. It's a webinar. But again, be forewarned that when things come repeatedly, you actually attend to them less well, even if they're important. Let's do the pictures. So test-enhanced learning is best characterized by this picture. These are the kind of classic flashcards where there's a question on the front and the answer on the back. So that'll be our image for test-enhanced learning. For desirable difficulties, the picture, this is here you see the picture of the brain lifting weights. And it doesn't lift weights and get more muscular, but it is true that effortful learning is different than less effortful learning. And much like the comment I made earlier, where too much is not helpful and too little is not helpful, there's an amount of effortfulness that actually helps us learn. That's called desirable difficulties. Spacing, you see the open road here going off into the distance. So learning and then relearning over time. Interleaving, not really a word that I ever use or knew, but essentially it means this kind of deck of cards or pages of a book smushed together. So you one thing, another thing, another thing, mixing learning. The self theories of Carol Dweck. Now, interestingly, if I show this as the image, is this as good an image? This is as good an image as maybe some of these other ones. Like if you think about this image, which is exactly what interleaving is, or this image, which is the cover of a book, this is not actually the kind of image which is useful. So the mere fact of using images itself is not the value. You've got to use images which convey the thing, or they generate intrigue or something about the learning. So that's a much better image for the self theories of Carol Dweck. You see here the child falling off the horse, and the memory thing for us all is getting back up onto the horse, right? That sort of getting back up. The resilience in learning is critical for long-term learning and retention. Okay, 5 ideas. We'll start with the first, test-enhanced learning. So test-enhanced learning is sometimes referred to as the testing effect, or testing for learning, or retrieval practice. Some people in the kind of learning literature often refer to it as retrieval practice. Remember, we already have thought about this idea of putting the information in, sustaining it, and getting it back out. This is the getting it back out. I want you to remember the idea of flashcards. Also think about the Socratic method. Now, the Socratic method, I think we understand, has been under some scrutiny because of the idea of maybe the cruelty of the questioner and the experience of the learner. This is not consistent with the actual Socrates, as far as we know. The actual Socrates, I must confess, we don't actually know, because Plato wrote the stories about Socrates. And I'm distracting you right now with a story to try to make you remember it better. But anyway, the actual Socrates was understood to be someone that people craved to get into discourse with. These back and forth that Socrates would have were very interesting to the interlocutor, to the other discussant. So when we think about the Socratic method, what we really just mean is questioning. That the teacher is doing questioning. That does not need to be disrespectful, and certainly it should not be. You might think of it also through the lens of quizzing. So quizzing could be quizzing oneself, which I'll give a story about in a moment, or being quizzed, much like the Socratic method or any test we might take, or even flashcards. As to quizzing oneself, so if I stopped right now and said, okay, I want you guys to just, I want you all to think about what have I said so far? That's me quizzing you. But you could, as we've been going, been quizzing yourself already. That talkative guy, he said there were 5 things, and something with Michigan, I forgot that Michigan thing, but there's like these 5 things, and pictures are helpful. The sort of recitation or trying to remember what the 5 things are, trying to do the work in real time, so quizzing yourself in real time, is a helpful way of holding on to things. Now, it might come as no surprise now. These deans in this room have seen me since I was a young boy, meaning like 10 years ago. And when they saw me then, I had substantially better hair. Over this time, what I will tell you is it's much harder for me to simply learn something, to hear something, and hold on to it, even like 5 minutes later, right? So what's a classic learning sciences trick that I do now? Let's say I'm driving to work and I hear something on the radio that interests me. I will, at that moment, as I'm listening, start recounting it to myself or quizzing myself about it. I think I heard this. Or if I'm reading, I will cover up sometimes what I just read and ask myself, what did I just read on that page? What did that say? What was the meaning? So real-time quizzing as I go. So I want you to really hold on to this idea of being quizzed, quizzing others, and quizzing oneself. I think at this point I have to make one more aside. So I'm from upstate New York, and I gesture plenty. I understand we gesture across the entire state. It turns out that actually even movement itself has some benefit to learning. There's actually a very interesting book called The Extended Mind. Some of you have read that. And there's in the book, a lot of the evidence base for how movement is helpful for learning as well. So you'll see me also gesturing a lot because I'm also doing my over 40 techniques of not trying to forget stuff. 2 people. One could quiz the other and have the answer back. One could quiz the other and help the other learn how to quiz themselves. One can have this proclivity to quiz themselves. And I wish you to also picture this image in your mind as we go forth. This in real time quizzing of yourself is a very powerful way of doing retrieval practice for learning. So here is a classic paper from the learning literature that talks about this. And it gets us to the original studies of test-enhanced learning. So a story goes like this. 120 undergraduates at Washington University of St. Louis, you see their ages, they were given two passages. One passage was about the sun, and one was about dolphins. And you see how long they were. And in the design of the experiment, it went like this. One of the groups would study the material, have 5 minutes of distraction. You see my little distractions already in this talk. 5 minutes of distraction, followed by studying the same material again. It was like a one-page sheet. The other group being tested would have studied the material, have 5 minutes of distraction with math questions. They basically were little simple math. And then they would actually be given a blank piece of paper to write down everything they remember having read from the piece they studied 5 minutes ago. So study and then being tested. And then each group would be tested 5 minutes later, 2 days later, and a week later. So you could study, math distraction, study, 5 minutes, 2 days, 1 week. Study, math distraction, right on the paper, then quizzed 5 minutes, 2 days, and 1 week. Okay. You see the 5 minutes, 2 days, and 1 week are the three pairings. If you study and restudy, and you compare it to study and testing, that's study and then the blank paper, the study restudy people do better at 5 minutes, which is basically proof that cramming does work for a test that's very, very soon thereafter. So the deans will always bristle. No, don't tell students don't tell them to cram. Cramming is not the great thing. Cramming is useful if your goal was to be great 5 minutes later, right? So there's utility in this in a practical way. There's an enormous problem though with solely cramming, which is that even 2 days later, the study and then quiz yourself groups that does better than the study restudy group. 1 week later, and in perpetuity, the longer out they go, still study, then write it all on a blank paper does substantially better than study restudy, just not at 5 minutes. Let's look at another study of this. 180 undergraduates, different people. They were divided into 3 groups of 60. They also got either the dolphins or the sun, these short paragraphs about those. But here's the 3 groups that were in the study. One group read the material, had 5 minutes of math questions, read the same material, 5 minutes of math material, 5 minutes of math material. Study, 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 or SSSS. Another group studied the material, math, restudied the material, 5 minutes of math, restudied a third time, math again, and then they got the blank paper. Please write down all the things that you recall having read in those paragraphs that you've now studied 3 times. And the last group only got the material 1 time, got 5 minutes of math, and then got the blank paper. What do you recall from what you read? Then 5 minutes of math, then another blank paper, then 5 minutes of math, and then another blank paper to write down or recount what they had learned. And all the groups were then quizzed at 5 minutes and at 1 week. So again, if you look at the 5 minutes later, you'll see that the cramming effect does work for passing the test that's 5 minutes, that's soon thereafter. Study, 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 cram, 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 cram. But even a week later, again, the study does substantially worse than those who had to reproduce it, retrieval practice, the testing effect, testing for learning, flashcards. The testing yourself group does substantially better a week later, and then again in other studies, if it's longer into the future that you're tested, you retain more if you were quizzing yourself along the way. There's a fun other way of looking at this. Put the axes on here. How much do you forget over the week? And then you kind of look at the learning conditions, whether you were studying, or whether you were testing yourself. So those who crammed forget substantially more than half, over the course of the week, compared to those who got tested themselves once with 1 blank paper at the end, versus those who only forgot 14% at the end of the week if they had tested themselves serially. So there's lots and lots of literature on now the testing effect, the idea that you quiz yourself or practice retrieving as a mode of learning. Before I do the summary, I'm going to do a summary slide for each of our 5 elements. Let me say this. There are a couple of things here that tend to bristle teachers, all right, or learners of all kinds. So the first thing I want to highlight is, it is true that if you cram, you can do well shortly thereafter. It's just that doesn't have substantial use, even 2 days or a week or further into the future, compared to if you quiz yourself. So that's interesting. How you quiz yourself, that you quiz yourself is often it's taken too seriously. So just doing flashcards or Anki or QBank or all these ways in which in medicine, these are examples in medicine of like study programs, quizzing programs, those alone are not as good as actually the ultimate way of approaching this, which is this. Learning frameworks doing questions, frameworks questions like that. So we can learn about, I don't know, the arteries that come off the heart and go into the neck and so forth, like learn it and then get quizzed about it or quiz yourself about it, right? You don't want to learn by quizzing alone. It's quizzing in the context of having done frameworks initially. So only study is not the highest advantage. Only quizzing is not the highest advantage. But having a framework and then getting quizzed, that's the highest advantage for longer term retention. So here's the summary. You learn for subsequent retrieval in the future through learning by retrieval in real time as you're studying the frameworks and so forth. That's the essence of test-enhanced learning. You learn for future retrieval by making retrieval part of how you actually learn initially. And you have your images there. Desirable difficulties. So this is educational theory. This is not educational science, which I'm going to start here. I'm going to get you to the educational science, which is what I promised for this talk. So this is the work of Lev Vygotsky, the great educational philosopher. And a lot of people have learned about this so-called ZPD, the zone of proximal development. So I'm going to show you this theory, and then I'm going to show you the empirical data that ends up showing that the theory was correct. On this slide, where there's lots going on, I'm going to break it apart by animating it. This blue on the bottom, that's the level of competence. This blue on the y-axis, that's the level of challenge. So challenge versus competence. Okay, that means that down here in the triangle, that's lots of competence, not as much challenge. They call it the boredom triangle, right? Very, very able at something, not very much challenge. Imagine playing tennis, I don't know, against the neighborhood 4-year-old, right? Even I could win that. Boredom. Up here, though, high challenge, not as much ability. That's the anxiety zone. So there is this sort of, again, there's this sort of sweet spot between too much and too little challenge. And this is the essence of what Vygotsky was posing as a theory for this zone of proximal development, the area that was the kind of the sweet spot between ability and challenge. So there's interesting parts to think about here. This red line, that's when you're, the border between the boredom area and the sweet spot, put it that way. This line is the border between the sweet spot at its utmost and just too much anxiety. So that's what the borders of the ZPD, or the zone of proximal development. Okay. Here's the actual writing of Vygotsky. No need to memorize this. I just want to show you what the actual language he used was. The zone of proximal development, that green bar, is the distance between the actual developmental level that one can demonstrate by problem solving, and the level of potential development that they could get to if they did a lot of work, if somebody helped them get there. So there's stuff you can do by yourself. There's kind of some maximum you might achieve, and through the hard work, you can get to that maximum. That's what that green essentially is. Here it is again. So there's one more thing I want to show you here. This is the zone, right? And it's best understood, I think, not by looking at it as a diagonal. Your eyes want to see it as a diagonal. We're going to do it a different way. We're going to think about how scaffolding, helping somebody, being the spotter, the weightlifting spotter, the helper, how that can get you up through the green zone. But up is meaning vertically through. So I'll show you this. Here's one's level of competence. All right. Pretty competent. There's no challenge at all. As you start to get more and more challenge, you eventually run out of the ability to do it all by yourself. When you hit that green, you no longer can do it alone. Okay. You can imagine then, you keep getting help. There's some point where even with help, you cannot do it. So on this call are Dean Smith and Battinelli. I am absolutely certain, and they know this, that no matter how much help I got, I could never, ever do the job that those two people did at leading this institution, right? There's not enough help in the world that can help me do that. All right, so for many of us have limits, and I want you to think of the green as like, even with the maximal amount of help and workout and challenge, you just can't do more than that, all right? But it's very important to imagine that we can still maximize whatever we can do. All right, so that's the key. That's what this idea of scaffolding is. It's that through help, through the hard work, you can maximize whatever level you could get. All right. So what are desirable difficulties then? This is the science of Vygotsky's theory. We'll give a shot at this. So now, again, I realize I can't see all the people on the webinar. If all of you were asleep, I'll never know. But for those of you whom I can see, do any of you recognize this? Well, how might you read this?
Do you want us to actually try and read this?
Is it familiar to you? Do you see it?
I can fill in some of the spaces, but I don't recognize it in total as a something that should perhaps be recognized.
Fair enough. Absolutely fantastic. But thank you for striving to do so. That effort of trying to do so would benefit you ultimately if it was important for you to memorize this piece. I will reassure you, it's totally fine not to know. When we get into the Q&A, I'm interested in knowing if anybody recognized it. I gave a talk like this with this example in downtown London, and at the Wellcome Trust. So pretty much everybody there was British, and they didn't know either. So it's perfectly okay not to know the piece from Macbeth. It just strikes me that the British maybe should have known, but okay. This is how we all learn it. It turns out that you actually get quizzed this way or have this challenge, right? If you've seen this framework a bit and then are given this, you actually remember it better than if you just did this over and over and over again. It's kind of strange, it seems to me. Or how about this? People actually do these studies, right? I'm imagining that there's lots of other kinds of ways we could imagine doing studies in medicine, but in social psychology and cognitive psychology and the neurobiology of learning and these things, we're trying to figure out how the human brain learns. If you make it harder to read, people slow down, they work harder, and they are more able to memorize it. It's kind of strange, but it's just a good example of what a desirable difficulty might be. I'm not sure it's desirable, but so there are very careful studies of what is required to slow somebody down enough to cause them to increase their focus enough to increase learning. Of course, there are not desirable difficulties. Like I speak too quickly. This is clear, right? That is not a good difficulty. That's not helping you at all. So it's not that anything difficult is helpful, just like any picture isn't helpful in the example of the Dweck book cover. I just had her cover up her book, Self Theories. That's not a good picture. Showing the child falling off the horse, you're going to see that's a good picture. Showing you this page right here of the cover of the article doesn't tell you much. You're not going to memorize this cover right here. So not all pictures are good for retention, and not all difficulties are good for retention, but desirable difficulties are. So let's think more about that.
I might just offer to you that in the Q&A, we had several people recognize that this is from Macbeth. We have an offering of which act it's from, and maybe even some subsequent language. So the team is on it.
Okay, all right. With that, let's just do this for a second. These are going off to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow. A poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the right. So good. Ha! And I only memorized that because I was being rather stressed out as a high school junior. And I did not have any of these learning sciences to help me. So I want to applaud the audience for that. You've yet again, we've outdone our British friends. But I commend the audience very much for knowing that, but also just wanted to say that, when we're trying to memorize things and hold on to them for the long term, we could go through the way that we might have learned things back in the day, but there are these sciences of learning that actually substantially help learning and retention. So I just want to make a sort of another pandering appeal. But great job, chat. And Samara, please keep throwing in the chat things in there. So I was making here the point that not all images are terrific and not all difficulties are desirable. All right, so look at this one. When the outline of a lecture proceeds in a different order from a textbook passage, the learner's effort to discern the main ideas and reconcile that discrepancy produce better recall of the content. I'm going to pause. Is it the best thing for me to put this quote up here and then read it to you? So it's better for me to actually just say to you, I'm going to say something I want you to really pay attention to carefully, and then say it with no quote, or show you the quote and keep, which is hard to do, this mouth shut, and have you read it. For me to actually show it and read it, there's too many things going on at once. So we also have to learn about the notion of cognitive load, right? There are things that distract us. That's not a desirable difficulty. That's in the way, right? So I just did that the wrong way to emphasize. Better just to show it. So I'm actually going to have you read it again now with the intent that you learn it just for a moment here, and then I'll get back to it. Okay, so I counted to 7 seconds. 7 to 10 seconds is the great length of pause, by the way, if you're trying to teach learners. Ask a question, slowly count to 7, 8, 9, or 10, let your learners have time to ponder. As they make the effort to draw back the knowledge, that is actually helping learning, even if they never get to the answer to the question you asked. All right, but isn't this an interesting point? Like, one would think my lecture should be exactly in the framing and the order of the textbook. If it's too far off, it's not helpful. If it's slightly off the way the textbook read, it is helpful. So desirable difficulties to make somebody have to slow down and reconcile where they are. That gets us to the best part, in my view, of desirable difficulties, the idea of generation. Okay, so I'm going to make a point about the kind of a strong way to create desirable difficulties. Generation, this idea, this word, means problem solving. There's a great literature on problem solving. These are two of many. So generation is problem solving. But first we have to understand this, relevance and emotion, because there's problem solving abstractly and there's problem solving when something feels important. So I'm going to tell you a story that is very important to me. I think it's going to resonate with you, my guessing, because many of you are living in currently or have been in for a long time in the downstate part of New York. Okay. So when things feel connected to you, when they feel important to you, that is the utmost in problem solving, in generation. And many of you who are researchers know this, that you're absolutely thrilled and fascinated by solving the riddle of science or social science, whatever you're working on. Many of you who are clinicians know this. I just have to figure this out for my patient. It's not curious in a dehumanized way. It's your patient. You care deeply about that person and you really want to know and figure out and serve them. So relevance and emotion are key. So I'm going to show you this map here. Now, I didn't exclude you all from the map. You're down to the bottom of the map there, just like wanted to make it pretty. And tell you this little story, again, because stories have benefit. And this story is one of great relevance and emotion to me. I currently live in Cambridge, which is right around here. But originally, I was from there. Now, it is not true that people from Rochester, New York speak this quickly, and we usually have a much flatter accent than I've lost my accent, I think. But here's the thing, this is not about accents or that. It's about the fact that those two places are about 386 miles apart, Rochester to Boston, and there's one straight road that goes there, Route 90, the Mass Pike, the New York State Thruway, straight across. Why does this matter? Where is the relevance? What's the emotion? Right, so here's the problem. As I moved from the Rochester area to the Boston area, I started to notice something which was really, really irritating. So I'd wake up in the morning and the sun was up way too early. I'm lying there in my bed. It's like being in the operating room. It's the light. It's just too much light. It's inexcusably too much light. And remembering also that in Rochester, there's those beautiful long nights in the summertime, right? You could just sort of keep going out and keep playing and so forth. Or the sun didn't set too soon in the winter either. I mean, too soon for my taste, but not as early as Boston. The sun sets too early and it rises too early. Something is off. So I started to get this dark thought. Maybe we're in the wrong time zone, because I'm embittered by the fact that I'm getting up too early and it's just getting dark too early. I decided to try to figure out, are we in the wrong time zone? I mean, look, there's Maine right above us, and you got the Canadian maritime provinces above that, and there's this Atlantic time zone out there. What's going on? I was bitter. All right. So there's a way of solving this, and I'm going to show you how to solve this. I'm going to solve this first by telling you that we're going to use generation, but I want to distinguish generation from recall. Okay, so I could just turn around right now and say to you, so where am I from? And you'd say Rochester. Yeah, so that kind of quizzing is fine, but that's pure recall is not nearly as robust or as useful for long-term learning as problem solving. So you may need recall for problem solving. I mean, how much content knowledge does one need to discern a diagnosis, right? You need content knowledge, you need to have some recall ability, but generation is something quite better. So I'm going to do that. Here's a recall. I'll do 2 recall questions, then we'll get on to the generation. So here's the first question. Remember, this is all about the Rochester to Boston, disturbance in my life. What is the definition of the cosine of an angle? So smart, you have a great, you've got a great audience. They know Shakespeare. Let us see what the chat says about this. What is the definition of the cosine of an angle? He asks Socratically.
As we await some responses in the Q&A, I'll share a comment there that one of our participants says that they are also from Rochester, and notice that you say both Rochester and accent with a Rochesterian
That is
accent.
brilliant. So just for that person really is from Rochester, because most of us don't put the Rochester. It's just like Rochester. That's one. And the accent is the accent. So kudos to that person. Anybody for the, I love that.
So yes, we do. So we have adjacent over hypotenuse and we have opposite over hypotenuse.
That's very good. I appreciate anybody who was willing to try that one out. That one is just a cruel question. So the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. The cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And we will show it right here. There's our triangle. Cosine is the ratio of the length of the adjacent to that little angle over there. The hypotenuse, the longest side. At this point, people are wondering, where is he going? What does it possibly have to do with solving the problem of the time zones that he seems strangely affixed to? Recall question number 2. Just demonstrating that recall is not the same thing as generation. What is the equation of the circumference of a circle? You're noticing the 7 seconds of pause again, important. Right now, you're trying to draw it back up. These retrieval pathways are going.
Okay, we have 2 pi r and we have pi times the diameter.
Excellent. Both are correct because the diameter is 2r. So the circumference is 2 pi r or pi times the diameter. Exactly. There's the radius, multiply that by 2 and then by pi, 3.14159, and you have the circumference of the circle. Now, those are both recall. Neither of those is generation. What is generation? Generation would be this. Problem solving. Assuming the Earth is a perfect sphere, and the equator is 24,000 miles around, it actually nearly is. Well, there's 24 time zones, right? So the average width of a time zone at the equator is 1,000 miles wide. 24,000 divided by the 24 time zones, 24 hours in a day, right? 1,000 miles wide at the equator. But the question really is, what is it between Rochester and Boston at my latitude? What is the average time zone width at a latitude of X degrees, meaning the degrees where I live? You need this to do that. There's a way in which you can make here's the sphere of the Earth. You can solve this problem by basically putting the radius of the Earth there, right? And you can figure out the radius is there as well. Interesting, right? The radius and the hypotenuse can be the same here. That green line goes up to my latitude. The angle is the latitude. So you can put your little triangle in there. Then you can just solve it by doing the cosine. And you figure that out and you get that radius at my latitude, which you can then turn into the circumference of my latitude. And then you can divide it by 24 and know what the time zone width is. And my bitterness bears out. We should be in the Atlantic time zone. There's no need for us to be doing this in Boston. And I should not be getting up so early. So there it is. All right. Generation is problem solving. It is not just recall, and such things when you have emotion and you really care about them are much more memorable. I don't actually know geometry so well. I just was annoyed by this. You create learning by creating necessary effort and slowing down. So you see the tilted Shakespeare there. And from generating, you see the time zone solution over there, beyond mere recall. The field of desirable difficulties has to do with what can make us slow down and focus, and what can make us have this sort of deep interest in problem solving and solving problems beyond mere recall. At this point, I'm just inclined to ask, does anybody recall the other 3? The mere fact of my asking whether you recall the other 3 itself, if I could wait 7 seconds here, itself should be helpful for the memorizing of them. How about that one? Or that one? Of course there's this one. That's spacing, interleaving, and the self-theories of Carol Dweck. All right.
People are answering and paying attention and remembering.
The Zucker School. Ladies and gentlemen, this is absolutely fantastic. So we're going to go on. I appreciate that very much. We're going to go on to one more. Spacing and interleaving can be turned into longitudinal and integrated. These are, I just want to explain these words because sometimes you hear these words and it's confusing about which one's which and why. So spacing in the education science literature is sometimes referred to longitudinal in the education design literature. Interleaving in the education science literature is often referred to integrated in the educational design literature. Just so you're familiar with these words. So, but we're going to do the science, not the design. Okay, so the spacing effect is difficult. And by my telling you it's difficult, that hopefully that gives you a little bit of emotion. It's also super interesting. The way to do this is through using a very complicated graph, which I'll do on the next page, but I'm going to animate that graph with colors and pictures to make it come alive, which I think will make it substantially simpler and useful, hopefully. So, but you have to know three things because it's a three-dimensional graph. So there's three axes. So this here, the test delay is the time, the amount of time between when you study something finally and when you're tested. The study gap is the amount of time between learning something and relearning something, which is the essence of spacing, the space between learn and relearn. How much you retain is the third axis of the graph. So test delay between your final learning and when you're actually asked or need to know it. It could be the test of life. You learned how to put in IVs and then a month later you got to put in an IV. It's the test of life, not a test, but it could be an examination or a test also. So three axes, the study gap, the test delay, and the amount retained. Here's the kind of scary looking graph. I'll now animate it. That's test delay, the time between when you finally learn something and you need to know it or show it. That's study gap, the time between learn and relearn episodes. That's how much you retained, the test score. So the way this works is this. Up here in the Northeast, the sort of top right of the graph, the test delay is very short. It's like that 5-minute scenario we posed earlier with the test enhanced learning bit, right? You're just being quizzed immediately after you learn something. And as with that other example, people retain a lot when they cram, when there's no delay from when you learned to when you're tested, right? But what if there's even a little test delay here, like 3 weeks or 4 weeks? Right? Like it's substantially lower how much is retained. There's many studies that show this sort of 90-something to 20-something drop in 1 week. So here you see it's more than 1 week. So it's even larger than it's like 18% or 16% something here. So it's a lot of loss of learning in only 3 weeks. What about this? What if we make it a year or nearly a year? Thud, right? So it's really like nearly nothing is retained in a year. At this point, I feel compelled to say that no matter how awful this talk has been so far, as your kickoff, your inaugural event, you bring in the friend, no matter how badly I have done, I am totally safe because 1 year from now, you will not remember a thing I've done. They'll forget me. I can walk through the school. It's all good. But it's disturbing, is it not, that we think we study so hard and then a year later, we don't really have it. So what does the spacing effect tell us or teach us? So you put in some study gap, some time between learn and relearn, and you can get back up on the curve. Now you will observe that after a year, we still don't hold on to so much, right? Although it's interesting to me that 1 year out with an adequate study gap, you retain about the same amount as you retain like 3 weeks out with no study gap. So that's sort of interesting. But there's something much more important, even than this. It's the red line there. So you see that's kind of, you can sort of see there's a red line. I usually turn it into color so you can see it. Now the red line is actually not coming smoothly straight down the face of this mountain. It's actually turning, so I'm exaggerating that turn with this green line. What does this turn mean? Like, how do I think about that in 3 dimensions? It actually means the longer you want to retain something, the more study gap you need to be on that red line, which is the maximum amount of retention, the best you can do for any amount of test delay. So if you want to really maximize your retention, you need more and more and more study gap the longer out you seek to hold the information. Another way of looking at it is this way. If you look at this shape here, isn't it interesting? There's like a plateau on the one side going towards the words test score, and there's a cliff on the other side going towards the words test delay. So that means if you give too much study gap, too much time between learn and relearn, yeah, you're not maximized, but you're still up on the mountain. But if you have too little study gap, like you don't really do enough space between learn and relearn, you're off that cliff and you really are far from the maximum that you might retain. So study gap matters. And if you're going to make a mistake, do too much study gap, not too little. And the more study gap is needed for the longer you want people to actually hold on to stuff. All right, so let's now just summarize that. Oh, sorry. So that's the summary. And then let's go to interleaving. So integrated design creates the interleaving effect that, remember the cards smushed together. You can block by type. You do A, then you do B, then you do C. You also can interleave. You can do A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B, multiple things simultaneously. So we were together in person. I would say, how many of you speak a second language? People. How many of you speak a third language? People raise their hand. And then how many of you have spoken 3 languages since you were little? And then people will raise their hands. And it's interesting because in the language learning literature, those who learn multiple languages simultaneously as little people actually develop speech delay. So they're not as good at any one of those languages initially as a peer who's only learning one of the languages. But if the 3 language learning person goes forth and keeps learning all 3 languages, they can catch up in all 3 languages so that they're as good at any one of them as a person who only learned one. And that sounds like good enough. They have 3 languages, the other soul has only one. But there's something better than that, which is if you teach the 3 language learning person a 4th language, which is substantially different. So let's say they learn, I don't know, English, German, and Spanish. Then you want to teach them Russian, or English, German, Spanish, you want to teach them Mandarin, Chinese. That 4th language, even if different in its nature, is substantially easier to learn by the 3 language learning person than by a 2 language learning person than by a 1 language learning person. So not only do they have 3 languages, they actually have a better center for learning any language subsequently, even material they haven't seen before, right? The language center is more flexible and able to learn new information. That's a huge benefit. The interleaving literature reminds us that there is a speech delay. There's something that's not as comfortable or good in the early time when you first are learning the languages, but the benefit on the back end is huge. So here, this is the graph that classically we'll see. If you're tested immediately after interleaved learning and block learning, block by type, often called massed learning, M-A-S-S-E-D, being quizzed 5 minutes later, it's better to have crammed subject by subject by subject. Cramming still works, and separating subjects is better for 5 minutes later. But even a week later, look at the difference. And again, if you do this in more than a week later, you see this longer out into time. So I like to make the sound effect here too. Right? Block learning just does not sustain in the same way that interleaved learning does. Some people speculate that this actually is a desirable difficulty, doing multiple things simultaneously. How about this? You could learn math and then no more math. And then English, and then no more English and no more math. Sports, then no more sports, then no more English and no more math, and so forth. By the end of that year, you are not good at calculating, you are not good at writing, right? And you are not fit. We do not do this. We do not do this in grade school. We do not do this in elementary. We don't do this in school. We do not do things in blocks like this. However, so this is what we do in school, right? You learn English, math, you do sports and biology, you do all these, whatever, you do all these things across the course of the year, spaced and interleaved. But of course, in medicine, we do this. In fact, medicine may be one of the rarest and maybe perhaps only example of this. Even in many other kinds of professional school, the courses are substantially longer. Like the clinical practicums are longer. In music, and an array of PhD programs, in law school, like there's all of these substantially longer experience. But we look at the top as normal and the bottom as strange. So it's interesting, we sort of don't do spaced and interleaved in our design of the clinical year. Now, your school, again, which let me just say, I've loved knowing, is particularly attuned to this and has been very careful to think about longer sustained like clinical work and so forth into the first year, and many other elements that have importantly used spacing and interleaving. But I would just call that both highly commendable and really just too rare in the US. So you have been a critical leader. And of course, I've seen Dean Smith give talks about this. And it's back in the day. And it was very, very important to sort of motivate the idea of longitudinal learning, in different phases of the curriculum, and the merits of this model. So even if it's not yet in some schools have this in their clinical year and some schools do not, this idea is still very important to entertain. Learning and relearning over time and doing multiple things simultaneously. So the idea of spacing, use time, create enough time between learn and relearn. That's this here. Interleaving. You see the images, right? Mixed experiences, learn and practice multiple domains at once. And we can do that in the early years of med school. We can do that in other years of med school. We can do that in things outside of medicine. We can do that in our own lives when we're trying to learn things. If you're trying to learn your new language and you're at my age, sort of learn some language, go do something else, learn some language, go do something else, mix it with some other thing. The final domain is substantially easier than those two. Oh yeah.
I'll just offer you a comment from the Q&A about the, after you finish the first run through of space, there was a comment that you need to come back again so that we will retain what you say.
It is too generous, but if you say come back, I'm going to come back because I just love the place.
Thank you.
I mean, sincerely, I appreciate you all. I appreciate this school so much. I will say that part of what I should just be explicit, and Carol Dweck's work would say to be explicit. When we teach, we should use the because. So I appreciate the school so much because there was a really, really deep, enriched, careful planning that led to the school's inception. So many people who are here in the leadership and the former leaders and many of you together worked really hard at thinking, what ought this be? Not what does it have to be based on other schools? What ought it be in our context, for our learners, for our community, based on our institution's great strengths? How should this be? So there's a lot of deliberate and intentional work. That's kind of a desirable difficulty thing. So I just want to commend that and say how much I just enjoyed learning of this. All right, the self theories of Carol Dweck are next. Now, just for fun, again, this is not how you do an image. That's how you do an image. We should look at this image much more carefully now, just in this closing part here before the questions and answers. It comes from some interesting sources. I've shown you the Vygotsky stuff that led us to desirable difficulties. Well, here are all of these educational philosophers and theorists who helped us get to Carol Dweck's work. Dewey, obviously, democracy in education. Carl Rogers, relationships in education. Social learning theory of Bandura. Noddings is the great feminist and moral development thinker. Keegan, the adult development thinker. Lave or Lav and Wenger. Situated learning, communities of practice. Billet about workplace learning. All important theories. The empirical work that followed, though, was really taking Bandura's work, that of Martin Seligman, who studied learned helplessness, and getting us to Professor Carol Dweck and her extraordinary colleagues and graduate students over 40 years, like an unbelievable canon. Now, many people have read the book Mindset, which is fun, and it's a nice popularized book, and I think it's great. But if you really want to see like core Dweck at its best, you'll buy the book Self Theories. That one, I don't have any proceeds from this book, but it's a very, very brilliant book, and much more of her sort of core work, less pop culture-y, I think. But in essence, she studied learning and studied resilience. And the question was this: what caused all this great work on the so-called self theories to emerge? How does it relate to this picture? So it comes from a study, I believe it was 1978, maybe 79. And they were looking at children in first grade in the classrooms. Now, I'm just going to make one caveat for respect. The researchers refer to the children as boys and girls. And I think we know now, it's not 1978 anymore, that the terms for these gendered terms were not carefully applied in this research. So it's, how to say, it's very binary in these descriptions. And again, they say boys and girls based on assumptions and so forth. So I don't want to be participating and sort of like not being thoughtful about this. I just want to characterize this the way the original research was, with all modern sensitivity included too. When they observed the children, those who they perceived as boys were kind of running around like a pack of squirrels. If they could just sit in the chair, well, it was a great day. I see the way Dave Hirsh is sitting in his chair, right? That was a good day for me, right? They weren't, the boys weren't getting as much feedback, and the feedback was not as dramatic or big. Those they perceived as girls were doing great work, actually. And of course, they were sitting in their chairs. They were actually diligently doing the work and achieving substantially better as a whole. And they were getting more feedback, more voluminous feedback, and much more like rich feedback. Outstanding, excellent. That's great, Liz. Amazing, Samara, right? So that kind of stuff. They gave the children problems they could not solve. And the boys would sit there, trying to figure this out. Let's figure this out. They were very into trying to problem solve generation. And those they perceived as girls quit. And they would say things like, I've never been good at this. I'm not good at math. I'm so stupid. Like really not a lot of negative self-talk, which is extremely upsetting. But this is really not good. And the researchers were bothered, the teachers were bothered, a lot of people were bothered. But they were great empiricists. So they kept studying and looking and observing and trying to figure this out. They thought maybe it's in the feedback. So what they did was they observed something. They had the teachers give the girls feedback much like they were giving the boys. It had to be accurate and correct to the level of the work. But what the girls started to get was, I noticed the way so-and-so is doing such and such, like verbs. Like Samara, the fact that you've been nodding and smiling at me this entire meeting has meant a lot to me because it makes me feel like I'm really doing okay. So you're making the commendation and clarifying what it's about. It's an action thing. It's what Dean Ginsburg is doing, right? Just for the record, I call her Samara because she's my friend, but I want to make sure I acknowledge that your incredible accomplishment. So, right, but I'm acknowledging what you're doing, right? I could now switch it around such that let me see, David Hirsh. In the original scheme, the girls were getting the big adjectives, brilliant, excellent, or adverbs, excellent. The boys were getting the action. In the switch around, the girls were getting the action, the boys were getting the good job, Hershey, right? Just like I'm getting sort of the inexplicit good. They gave the children problems they could not solve, and the effect switched over. And the boys were, I'm so stupid, I can't do this, this is boring. And the girls would hang on, I haven't figured this out yet. What's going on here? They thought that feedback was the key. But over the next decade of research, it turns out they found something else. And that's what's called the self theories, how people perceive themselves in different domains of learning. It's very important. So the question was, why do people fall apart, quit, despite having had praise and having some confidence and having a long history of success? That was their question. She posited eventually, 10 years later, posited two implicit theories or self theories. How we perceive ourselves, even if we don't know we're perceiving ourselves that way. That's why they're called implicit. The entity theorist and the incremental theorist. The entity theorist, the language evolved, is now the person with the fixed mindset or a performance orientation. That's the language you sometimes hear in education nowadays. Whereas the incremental theorist was the person with the growth mindset or the master orientation. And they characterize these. Entity. I'm good at languages. That's like a Dave. He's like a language person. Turns out I'm really not. But like this idea that I and what I can do are a thing. Incremental theorist. Let's say Dean Ginsburg says to me, so Dave, do you think we could run a 5K together if we both trained? I would say, yeah, I think if we trained, we probably could do that. No doubt Dean Ginsburg can run a 20K right now. But for someone like me, I'd think to myself, yeah, if I work hard at that, I can do it, right? That's a kind of growth mindset, the idea that the work makes it possible, as opposed to I'm not an athlete, or I'm an athlete, right? The entity. So this has a really thick canon of science behind it now. So self-theories are networks of belief, often held unconsciously, right? And I'm going to give you like the quiz part here. Self-theories are domain specific. So you could be like an entity theorist about intelligence and an incremental theorist about talent or moral character. It's not about you as a whole. It's about some domain. So quite literally, I don't know why it is that I perceive myself that I'm not a language person. And I don't even know why it is I perceive myself that I could be fit and a good athlete if I try, right? Like I just hold, I don't know why I hold those views, where that come from. So they're kind of unconsciously held by me, and I'm trying to get rid of them. Or I try to be incremental or growth minded in each. But even if I worked hard at Portuguese and Spanish, I kind of feel like I'm just not good at this, as if somehow it's about me as opposed to the effort. So watch. It's very interesting. In the general population, right, for any given thing, intelligence, talent, language ability, moral character, when you large studies across lots of ages and different domains and countries, it's always around 40% of people are entity theorists in that domain, always around 40% are incremental theorists in that domain, and there's some kind of group in between. It's surprisingly reproducible. I'm exaggerating a bit. It's not always identically 40, but it's surprisingly reproduced. So what are these things? Okay, I'm giving you some hint at them. Let's do a little quiz. If a person is an entity theorist, faced a problem, right? A hard one, what would happen? So they're more likely to quit or to feel bad about themselves. I can't do it, right? Because they have the fixed mindset and this sort of performance approach where I only want to really try things I'm good at. I wouldn't want you to think of me as someone not good at that. Whereas incremental theorists, when they face a problem, they may go slowly and carefully, but they're going to go forth trying to solve it, right? Because they have the growth mindset and the mastery approach. They're actually nourished by the process. I don't have it yet. I got to figure this out. I don't have it yet. There's something nourishing, but they're trying. Entity and incremental theories are equal in the general, entity and incremental theorists in any domain are equal in general intelligence and in baseline achievement in that domain. But what's interesting is not an ultimate achievement. Why? It's predictable. Why? Because the incremental or growth people go further. Again, because they're nourished by the challenge. One quick thing. We're all familiar with this idea, or we may be familiar with this idea of the 10,000 hours, right? It's sort of this popularized idea of the 10,000 hours, which gets into the work of K. Anders Ericsson from Florida State. The idea is if you just keep doing lots and lots of stuff, you'll get better. True. If you keep doing things lots and lots of times, you'll get better. But to expertise, it's not just getting better. It's getting better as you get corrected. You've got to have somebody looking at you, correcting you. That isn't just about getting better. It's about getting substantially better yet. We have to make mistakes and have someone correct us to reach our ultimate potential. You have to be willing to make those mistakes and be resilient in those mistakes, nourished by process. I thought this is kind of fun, given the political climate of our times. Entity theorists are more judgmental and rapidly adopt stereotypes than incremental theorists. No politics here, just wanted to throw that out there. Self-theories can be changed and lead to changes in behavior, and that's the most important thing. We can't be fixed about our understanding of the self-theories. We can have a growth perspective on the self-theories themselves, right? Quick story, and then I'll stop this whole thing. My son comes home from school. My wife is a real educator. She's not a hack like me. She's an actual educator, right? She knows the direct stuff in and out. She's read multiple papers on, more than I can count. We chose the school for my children based on whether it was really, really avowed to teaching around the self-theories and the growth mindset and using that framework. It's probably the most evidence-based thing in all of social psychology. We found the right school. It's a Dweckian school. My kids went there for a number of years. And then one day, Samuel arrives home. And he says to me, Dad, he's a little kid. Dad, I just have to say, I really love school and I appreciate how much they teach about the growth mindset, but I'm just not a growth mindset person. I was horrified. He's using a fixed mindset expression to characterize that he's not a growth mindset person. This is a disaster. I mean, for Sam, but also for my wallet, right? This is not good. So I look at him and I say, what? No, I just gotta tell you, I'm just not a growth mindset person. And I kind of lean forward and he says, yet. He said, yet, and then he winked at me, little devil, and he ran away. He is a growth mindset person. He said yet, because the idea is he'd keep working at it, right? So he actually was so sick of all the growth mindset stuff that he was now playing a growth mindset joke on me. But this idea of the yet matters enormously. I'm not there yet. I can't run the 5K yet. I'm not as good a runner as you all yet. I'm not really great at language yet, but I'll keep trying. I can get back up on that horse. I'm nourished by the process, right? Self-theories can be changed. We can have growth mindset ideas about our growth mindset, about our mindsets. So getting back up on the horse. We want to foster nourishment from the process, from the hard work, from getting back up, right? We want to fail forward. We want to have the power of yet. I'm not there yet. Okay, we will close this talk. We'll do Q&A. These are the 5 things we did at the outset. I understand you've seen them so many times, you're not paying attention. Pay attention. There's a point to this whole madness, right? Got them? So what are the 5 domains? And I'm going to pause for 10 seconds. Just try to draw them up. Okay. Can you picture one of the images or all the images? from one of the graphs, or one of the stories, the ridiculous story. But not just that, memorizing a list is not useful here. That's like recall, right? The real question is, what do these mean? So if we were live, I would quiz the audience right now. I'd say, tell me one of the things. I would ask someone to tell me one of the names. And I'd say, what does that mean? And I'd go through the 5, right? So I would name a domain, right? And you can offer the thought. So we don't have to do this with the chat, but just let's do it. We'll do it silently. I will say to you, test enhanced learning. And I would ask you, can you picture an image of that? What was that? What was that study at Washington University? What did we learn from that? Right? We go on like, sorry for the clicking prematurely. Desirable difficulties. The lifting weights, the strange Shakespeare, the Rochester absurdity, right? The sunrise and the geometry. Spacing, that 3-dimensional graph. More spacing. Spacing apart, repeating, spacing apart over time. More spacing is better than less spacing for long-term retention. Interleaving, the cards, A, B, C, B, C, A, C, A, B, the language example. And of course, dweck, the getting back up on the horse. We can be open-minded, have a growth mindset about the idea that we're not there yet, and try to find ways to be nourished by process. Get back up on the horse. We can use language which uses verbs. I want to say to Liz, who's here, like it was extremely helpful to work with you. You seem like an extraordinary leader. This whole talk took place only because of your brilliance. And you were incredibly quick with emails, even when I wasn't. Every detail covered, right? I'm deeply appreciative. And why am I? So affirm through the verbs what people are doing. Try to dissociate who they are from what they do. You're great, Liz. Nah, that is not dweck. It's not praise. It's identifying what it was and giving actionable things that you identify as being helpful. So you can, whenever you learn, try to pause and think about it, be ready to explain, try to really draw it back as you go. Cover the page up as you read the book. I will summarize them here and then I will stop. This was test enhanced learning. That was desirable difficulties. This was spacing. This was interleaving. This was the correct picture for Carol Dweck's work. And I always make sure to be a little bit pokey and provocative and say, what were those 3 things again from the Michigan study? Remember? And I think this mostly reminds us that it's not all about encoding and storage. It really is important to think about retrieval practice. But you have to do it with frameworks. Don't just quiz to learn. Quiz as part of your learning of frameworks. So that's our talk. And I will just summarize in the sentence, say, now the work begins, right? This is now the work begins. And maybe if I were being really true to the talk, I would say, now the hard work begins. After all, it's desirable difficulties. Maybe I would actually say, now the generative work begins, because it's really about problem solving as a way of doing our learning. Or perhaps I might even say, now move it. Now the testing and self-quizzing work begins, because I want to just make sure stress again this idea of the recall. And I guess really now the space and interleave work begins, because I can never leave a talk without saying longitudinal integrated at least one more time. Thank you so much for having me. I think it's just absolutely a treat, even in webinar format when we can't interact. But now let's go to Q&A. And I think if we're going to really do this properly, I should think it's been an hour of this. And after an hour of you enduring a lot of learning sciences of learning, what would be really interesting to consider is how can we turn that towards curriculum redesign, curriculum reform. And conveniently, again, because Liz is so masterful at doing all things important for a talk to be excellent, we will have a way of you offering ideas for how these things might inform the curriculum redesign, the curriculum renewal. And the way to do that will be as follows. Actually, will one of you share? If I should stop sharing? Okay, I'll stop sharing. What we're going to do is we're going to have a capacity for you to put it into a web link into your phone, or to use a QR code. So that will pop up here in a moment. And so the idea here is just to try to be translational in our understanding of the educational sciences, in which we can take this talk and turn it. Here it is. You see the woo clap right there on in the chat. Right. So yep, you'll see over. In the chat is the link for your phone, or to put into your phone. Over here, if we click on the, you'll see the clicking. there's the QR. Yeah, how do we translate these sciences of learning into a curriculum design that honors your context, honors your area of expertise, honors what the students of the future, not a yesterday and today need, but the students of the future need to serve our patients and our communities. The Zucker School has been from its inception a place of grounding its curriculum, its processes in science, in excellence, and frankly, in being quite deliberate and not stuck in history, honoring history and regarding history, but not being stuck in history. So we'll see as people come, as the votes come in. I will say, I don't want to sound like I'm pandering. I just love the school because I do personally, even when you're not around. But I mean this quite sincerely. This is a rare and special school that is very intentional. It's about, we're going to design this to do what is the right thing for these learners in their future, for their care of patients, as scientists, as leaders. We're going to do this with an understanding of who we are, who they are, what our context is. So it's extremely admirable. Like you're quite lucky to be at a place like this. So it intrigues me to think, like, what should it be? What science can we bring to bear to make the future for the school and its students and their patients be what it ought to be? Yeah, I'm enjoying seeing these come down. I appreciate this longer one here. That's the second from the top on my screen. This idea of like we're applying a lot of theory. Well, I mean, applying theory is great. I would say apply empirical science. Like theory may or may not be true. The empirical science is a pretty dense evidence base. But the person who typed that in, the high expectations matters. People will rise to expectations.
So if it's okay, as people are still kind of responding to the prompt that you gave there, maybe I can offer a few questions to you from the Q&A that we received, if you could respond.
Lovely.
Excellent. All right. Oh, Dr. Smith is waving goodbye.
I'm waving goodbye to Dr. Smith.
So a couple of people asked sort of along the same lines of this question. Could you please comment on how you or other experts view Dweck's self-theories as it applies or not to the idea of imposter syndrome?
I am actually just like I'm bumpy at the question. Yeah, there's a reason why I'm bumpy. This morning, there's like a leading social psychologist, I think, in the nation, is a retired professor whom I got to meet for the first time today, and literally at, I don't know what, it must have been 11:48 this morning. That was what we were talking about. That exact question. So, okay, I won't be able to. She is an actual expert. I am actually not. But the essence of this was as follows. We can create for ourselves a growth approach. We can do the hard work of continually, not continuously, it's continually working to hold the growth mindset in whatever domains we're feeling imposterish about. Imposterism is legitimate. And I think it's I happen to do, I practice adult medicine in an OBGYN clinic. And so I want to say very earnestly and with a lot of heart, it is also, and it hurts me to say, it is also a gendered issue. If you look at surveys of imposterism, imposter syndrome, does not lay out evenly across the genders. So to my mind, it's also an important feminist issue and a justice issue. So, but certainly it's also a learning issue. And it is very much doing the work individually. It's very much doing the work communally, particularly if we're in groups who also have the same experience with one another, right? It's very important to do the work as leaders, to have the people who work with and for us to not experience that as much as possible. This is not about making, it's not about lowering expectations. Like a safe space is only good if that safe space is both safe and accountable, right? So I can do a small riff here. If I turn my computer around, right behind my house is where Amy Edmondson lives. She's the one who brought us to the modern understanding of psychological safety. And Professor Edmondson and Professor Higgins here at her colleague here, they would be very strong and clear about the idea that it's psychological safety and accountability. So safe is in that boredom zone, high competence, low challenge. So psychological safety and accountability. But by this, I'm trying to say that we can work through imposterism or imposter syndrome without lowering standards. But and not only can we should, but that's a multi-layered thing that involves the individual, their closest community, and the circles of community that go out and across the hierarchies. And I would think that's a very worthy thing to work at this and any school. If we liberate those who are withheld, better ideas, better science, better patient care all emerge.
Thank you. So many great questions in here. I'll try to put a couple together here. And this has to do with thinking about grading and testing. So, despite all this knowledge about how people learn, the question is, why do many schools still perform summative assessments of random facts as opposed to conceptual-based frameworks? And what are the implications for high-stake grades, clerkship grades? Just a little one for you.
It's such. I'm sure Dean Bettinelli is smiling at that one. We love this topic. When people ask me why are schools still ... I have lots of feelings about that. And I think since we're being taped here, I will be happy to proudly be a bit snarky, which is medical education is still a very orthodox tradition. And as a person who regards history and regards decorum and hierarchy, I regard these things. I do. I don't wish to be seen as a disruptor or some kind of counterculture person. But I do want to say, it's when orthodoxy serves values, is consistent with science, sign me up. When orthodoxy actually stands in the way of translating science, I don't get it. We're like, institutions are supposed to be doing science and we're rejecting educational science. That actually I find upsetting. I find it upsetting not because there's some great goal to change institutions. That's not a goal. The goal is for those patients to receive the finest of care from the finest of clinician scientists and leaders, right? And why would we not do everything we could? And by the way, when we try to change curriculum, we try to change schools to get away from some of this orthodox stuff, just the exact stuff that was mentioned and other things too, we're going to make tons of mistakes and should have the organizational growth mindset. My friend Nora Osman, Dr. Osman, she wrote a piece called the organizational growth mindset, how institutions themselves can adopt the growth mindset and be willing to make mistakes in service to getting better, right? This is actually, in some ways, the basis of the continuous quality improvement health system science movement, right? You don't want to make mistakes that hurt people, but we can make mistakes that are neutral or kind of clumsy. My whole talk has been one great mistake here, right? I blew the timing. We need more time for Q&A. Progress testing is likely better, and there's a literature about it. Some summative assessments are needed because at some point you've got to be able to name some things so that the next people in the chain residency have something to work with when they're choosing. But the overuse of summative assessments and the scourge of how people feel when being always summatively assessed is in the way of having the psychological safety and accountability. It's in the way of the growth mindset. You can see why it'd be in the way of the growth mindset because it's all about performance then. Don't show weakness.
We're on a mission. We're working there. So in that spirit, I guess, and that was not meant to be a leading question in any way, shape, or form, but I'll give you the last question, which we had hoped you would answer for us, just so we can try and wrap things up. Given all the things you've talked about, given all the things you think about, given the things you have and have not been able to do in the curriculums, that you have worked on, what would you say to this group is the David Hirsh is going to, put his nickel down on here's what you ought to be thinking about as you all move forward, in a courageous, but as our dean likes to say, not, what do you say? Courageous, but not reckless. Courageous, but not reckless. That's it. Way. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I just want to humbly say that, whatever thought I have, it's just my little thought. I would always want something to be contextually reverent. I admire this school enormously, as I've hoped to share, and I don't, my thought is my thought. I'm having trouble getting away from this idea. My duty, my sense of duty, my commitment, my full belief and energy in that patient in front of me. Everything. I'm energized and full of a desire to do really right by that patient in front of me. In other words, it's not about what's happening for me. How much can I learn? What residency can I get? Those things matter. Please learn a lot. Please, get the top residencies, and your graduates will. But the aim, the stance, the everything focuses upon. What can we do to have our learners, right, experience that what's the word? Maybe transcended. I don't want to be too dramatic, but maybe sacred. So this full-throated belief that what I'm doing is in service of patients in this community. I believe, now that seems like an evasive answer, but I believe that when people can in fact have the actual growth mindset, not the rhetorically cute one that's always out there, the actual one where I'm willing to make mistakes and show them so I can get better. I'm willing to have the hard discussions. I get real feedback and say, oh, I'm working on this. I don't have it yet. It's not all personal. Like I have to get better. Whatever we can do to have the real conversations, to open ourselves up to all of our frailties, learning frailties vis-a-vis our clinical, responsibilities, to really, really, really try to do what is required to aim towards that patient. That would be the most magical of schools. I will only close by saying that poor Dean Bettinelli and Dean Ginsburg are going to be familiar with what I'm going to say now. For me, that involves making longitudinal relationships. So, Samira, can I call you Samira in closing, at least, just for a moment? There's a reason why I'm doing it. If you were to say to me things about this talk, of which there were many, that you didn't prefer, not least violating the agreement on the time for questions and answers, but I would be able to hear it because I trust you. I trust that you would have my interest. You'd be doing that to help me out. And I wouldn't have to do woe is me, I stink, right? David, if I may, I'm using the first name purposefully. Like I trust you. You've been very big brothery to me for so long and very, very kind. And I know if you're going to be hard on me, that it's not about being hard for any other reason except for to really help me out in my career or whatever. If you have relational, they're both on sides of me. If you have relational trust, the conversation is entirely different. So could our students have enough relational trust that they can actually have a real growth mindset? That could actually be shaped in a way that really serves patients and society? And yes, their future careers. Wow, that would be a school, no? So I think I didn't practice that answer, but I think that's what comes to mind when you ask me.
I think that's fantastic. And it really brings us full circle to where we started this conversation about, really having a love of doctoring and caring for patients. So I think that's a nice way to tie that together. So just to take a moment, just to thank you for all of your insights, for your time and for your energy, which, is palpable even through the Zoom platform, and to thank everybody who joined us today for this really, really exciting and invigorating talk. And in particular, a huge shout out and thank you to our events team that has helped us to make it actually all happen. And so, Dr. Bettinelli, I don't know if you have any closing words.
Yeah, no, just to tell Dave, I'm sorry to tell you that you really screwed up, and you put yourself in such a tough position that you are going to have to come back. These guys are going to be hungry to hear more about what you have to say. So, no, all kidding aside, this is great. It always is. It's great because you know us. It's great because you've been, terrific about pacing us properly, and we agree with you that there are some things that we continue to do, perhaps unintentionally, that inhibit learning and inhibit getting everybody as good as they can be to help the patients, because of all sorts of confounding variables. And that's the process we're involved in now, to try to see if we could do better yet.
I would say thank you. Oh, I'm not going. I just want to say thank you so much to the audience and for you for having me. And I want to say I feel committed to make sure I answer all the questions in that Q&A. And so I'm happy to, if you want to forward those to me, I will try my best to answer them, maybe in a more truncated way than I would be with my big mouth. If there are things that could be better about the talk, I'm happy to do that. I don't want to, we should have had longer Q&A, and that was my rambling that made us not. So please tell me if there are other questions to be answered. I'm happy to think it through. Or people can write me or call me, whatever.
Thanks again, Dave.
Thank you so much, and have a great evening, and thank you to everybody who was here today.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as always.